My name is Kirsten and I'll be starting us off. So today we will be reviewing key points about the site investigation of vapor, including vapor attenuation factors. Jason will then go through an example, including calculations, and finally Liliana will describe certification clauses relating to vapors. So first off, what is vapor? Vapor is defined in the Contaminated Sites Regulation, or CSR, as gaseous emissions from soil, sediment, or water. So vapor does not include air emissions. As defined in Section 11 of the CSR, contamination exists if vapor from soil, sediment, or water, based on measured subsurface data, is above CSR standards in Schedule 3.3. In identifying vapor contamination, the breathing zone is an important area to investigate. It is defined in Procedure 8 as any place where humans could come into direct contact with contaminated vapor, including indoor and outdoor environments that exist at the time of site investigation, or have a reasonable potential to exist after a site investigation is complete. Vapor investigation is often required as part of the many routine applications that have already been discussed in this learning series, such as ministry certification documents, protocol applications, and high-risk reporting requirements. So when is vapor investigation required? For all site investigations, the process tends to start with a Stage 1 preliminary site investigation, which should identify if any CSR Schedule 2 uses have occurred at the site, and if volatile substances are potentially contaminants associated with those activities. Next, a Stage 2 PSI is typically conducted to identify if soil, water, or sediment is contaminated and confirm the presence of suspected contaminants. Vapor contaminants of concern are those associated with both Schedule 2 uses and for which standards are available in Schedule 3.3. If gasoline and diesel are suspected sources of contamination, then a refinement process can be used for the list of contaminants of concern. If substances in Table 1 of Technical Guidance 4 are below the detection limit in soil, water, or sediment on or near the site, and if there is no additional evidence suggesting that these substances are present, then they can be removed as contaminants of concern. If there are no further vapor contaminants of concern, then vapor at the site is not considered contaminated and a detailed vapor investigation is not required. But if a Schedule 3.3 substance is not in this table, such as trichloroethylene or TCE, and is a substance of concern based on Schedule 2 uses, then a detailed vapor investigation is required, even if initial soil, water, and sediment concentrations are below the detection limit. So once you've determined that a detailed vapor investigation is needed at the site, how is vapor characterized in the breathing zone? Soil vapor is collected from a subsurface or subslab vapor probe, such as the one shown in this rough sketch. Samples are then sent to a qualified lab for analysis. Samples should be collected from multiple seasons and years, such that there is sufficient confidence in the characterization of vapor contamination. 1 year of data may be sufficient, but only if accompanied by strong scientific evidence about the vapor plume. As per Protocol 22, the potential worst-case vapor concentrations expected in the breathing zone must be evaluated, and therefore sampling should target these areas. It should be noted that the estimation of exposure in the breathing zone using subsurface and subslab vapor data is Approach A in Technical Guidance 4. Approaches B and C in this technical guidance, which includes measuring ambient air and estimating vapor based on partitioning from soil or water, are not typically useful or adequate to characterize soil vapor for the majority of sites. The next step, where possible, is to apply vapor attenuation factors, or VAFs, to soil vapor data to predict breathing zone air. This is also known as attenuated soil vapor. So I'll say that again. Predicted breathing zone air is often referred to as attenuated soil vapor. It is this predicted breathing zone air concentration that is compared with vapor standards in Schedule 3.3. A site is considered to be contaminated for vapor if the subsurface or subslab concentration results in estimated breathing zone air above the CSR Schedule 3.3 standards. So before Protocol 22 VAFs can be applied to measured soil vapor, a few precluding conditions need to first be evaluated. First, is the groundwater in contact with the foundation slab at any time of the year? Or is there active pumping or drawdown of groundwater at the site, with the exception of parkades built to the 2012 or more recent BC Building Code? Next, is the subsurface or subslab vapor under pressure, such as at a landfill? Pressure may be present due to biodegradation of organic material in the soil. If any of these conditions are met, then the Table 1 vapor attenuation factors cannot be used. In addition, Table 1 footnotes include other specific conditions where the use of VAFs may not be permitted. So how are vapor attenuation factors, or VAFs, determined? A VAF is calculated based on the ratio of the breathing zone concentration of a volatile substance compared to the subsurface concentration of that substance. So as shown here, a VAF is specific to the relationship between either the subsurface or subslab vapor and either indoor or outdoor air. As shown by this equation, the concentration in predicted breathing zone air, or attenuated soil vapor, is equal to the vapor concentration in the subsurface or subslab multiplied by the VAF, or alpha. Protocol 22 has VAFs, or alphas, listed in Table 1 that can be used to estimate a breathing zone concentration. These VAFs are specific to indoor or outdoor exposure and are based on where the sample was collected and from what depth. As shown in the figure here, the sample depth referred to in this table is based on the vertical distance from the bottom of the bentonite seal to the bottom of the existing or proposed building foundation, or ground surface for outdoor exposure. And if the sample was collected between two depth increments, the shallowest depth is used. This table has several very important notes that must also be carefully reviewed prior to applying these VAFs. Within a detailed risk assessment, a site-specific VAF may also be calculated if an extensive vapor investigation was conducted. The vertical VAFs can be modified using attenuation adjustment divisors, or AADs, as shown in the equation here. Protocol 22 lists 3 AADs that are permitted and the criteria that must be met for their use. The first is the biodegradation AAD, or BAD, to account for attenuation that occurs as a result of biodegradation of some substances. So the first key point about the BAD is that it can only be applied for substances listed in Table 2 of Protocol 22, which is shown here. Other key criteria for use of the BAD include that it can only be used when there is a biologically active soil under the entire breathing zone. It can only be used if the sample has been collected within 1 meter of the vapor source. If non-aqueous phase liquids or NAPL is present, then there must be a 5-meter separation of biologically active soil between the vapor source and the building foundation or ground surface for outdoor air. And if NAPL is not present, then this separation distance only needs to be 2 meters. Finally, paved surfaces must account for no more than 80% of the area surrounding the target building. The parkade AAD, or PAD, is a set value based on modeling. In order to use the PAD, the parkade must span the entire footprint beneath the building. And the use of the PAD also indicates that an engineered system is relied upon in order to increase the air exchange within the parkade. And since the use of the PAD constitutes risk management for vapors, it can only be used under a risk-based application. The last AAD is the LAD, which accounts for attenuation that occurs due to lateral separation between the vapor source and the breathing zone of concern. The LAD can only be used when the target breathing zone is not directly above the vapors of concern. Furthermore, the LAD only applies to data collected beyond the vapor source in soil or groundwater, and the vapor plume must be stable or decreasing. Finally, the LAD can only be applied if the measured or attenuated vapor concentration in indoor or outdoor air at the point of measurement is less than 10 times the CSR standard. So if these criteria are met, then there are 3 tables in Protocol 22 with LADs that can be applied. For example, here is the table for the outdoor LAD, which can be selected based on the depth of the sample and the lateral distance between the sample and the target breathing zone. When characterizing vapor contamination at a site, there are a couple of key considerations. The first is whether preferential pathways are present and conveying vapor to nearby buildings. Next, is that vapor investigation needs to be conducted within 30 meters of the edge of the plume. So this may mean that if a nearby building has a different land use, as shown in this example, then VAFs for this potentially more restrictive land use needs to be applied to evaluate indoor air in this building, and the resulting concentrations need to be compared to those standards. The land use that determines the standards is based on the location and type of receptor. But if certain conditions are met, then it cannot be assumed that buildings beyond 30 meters are protected from vapor intrusion. These include if there is a known preferential pathway, if vapor is moving under pressure, if there's a continuous low permeability cover between the building and the vapor contamination, or if the vapor plume is expanding. It should also be noted that if vapors are identified off-site, a notification of actual or likely migration will need to be provided to the property owner. This was discussed a bit in presentation numbers 4 and 20. Next, when buildings are being evaluated for vapor intrusion, there are a number of additional investigation methods available, such as pressure testing, that can be used to figure out where vapors are getting into the building. Evaluating how the ventilation system is affecting vapor intrusion during different times of day or different seasons might be key for some buildings. All of these details about the site come together to create a thorough conceptual site model like these ones. The CSM helps to inform the vapor investigation as time goes on and can help to identify critical vapor intrusion points. So as a summary, the detailed vapor investigation must measure soil vapor in the subsurface or subslab. It must characterize the vapor plume and demonstrate that vapor concentrations are stable or shrinking if applying for a certificate of compliance. It must, based on subsurface or subslab data, capture the potential worst-case vapor concentration for the breathing zone following Protocol 22 for use of attenuation factors. And finally, the investigation must identify a site as contaminated for vapor if the subsurface or subslab data results in a predicted breathing zone concentration above the Schedule 3.3 standards. So that's it for me. Now, next, Jason will be presenting an example. Jason?
Thanks, Kristen. In the next part of the presentation, I'll cover example calculations for a theoretical vapor investigation scenario. In this scenario, the site is currently vacant. However, it was formerly used for a gas station, which had documented historical fuel releases to the environment. The current owner plans to redevelop the site, so the site use will change. The vapor investigation will need to evaluate both current and future uses for the site. The 2 site use scenarios will be discussed separately in the next few slides. Redevelopment plans include construction of a high-density residential building with 1 level of underground parking. On this slide, we'll consider the vapor investigation scenario using a conceptual vapor model. Let's first consider the site description and development plan. The former structures were removed and the site remains as a fenced-in vacant lot. The owner plans to obtain a certificate of compliance and develop a high-density residential structure with one level of underground parking, with a foundation base at 3 meters below ground surface. A remediation program effectively removed all soil contamination, but residual groundwater contamination remains at depth, approximately 10 meters below ground surface. The residual groundwater contamination consists of dissolved benzene, and the plume is shown here with green and yellow. Post-remedial investigation concluded that soil contamination was effectively removed, as indicated by concentrations below CSR standards, and groundwater contamination was delineated and stable, with concentrations above CSR standards and below upper cap concentrations, and no non-aqueous phase liquid was present. Volatilization from the dissolved benzene in groundwater resulted in an overlying vapor plume, shown in red. Multiple vapor monitoring wells were installed, which delineated the vapor contamination within the footprint of the future building and identified the worst case location. And well screens were installed at 4 meters below ground surface because the future development plan includes a building with a foundation at 3 meters below ground surface. For the current site use, only outdoor air exposure was evaluated, since there are no structures within 30 meters. On the next slide, we'll look at the vapor data calculations for the current site use scenario shown here. On this slide, we can see that the measured concentration from the worst case vapor well is 40,000 micrograms per meter cubed, which is shown in red because it exceeds the CSR vapor standard of 1.5 micrograms per meter cubed for residential use. However, this concentration is measured at 4 meters below ground surface, and there are no precluding conditions for applying a vapor attenuation factor, or VAF, so we can calculate predicted breathing zone air using an appropriate VAF. To do so, we need to choose an appropriate VAF from Table 1 of Protocol 22 for outdoor exposure with sample depth at 4 meters. As you can see in Table 1, there is no 4 meter sample depth, so we choose a VAF with the next shallower depth, which is 3 meters, corresponding to a vapor or VAF of 6.1 times 10 to the minus 7. Using this VAF, we can calculate the predicted breathing zone air concentration for outdoor residential receptors, which is often referred to as attenuated concentration. This calculation results in an attenuated concentration of 0.024 micrograms per meter cubed, which is less than the CSR standard for residential use. On this slide, we'll look at the future use scenario, which is a high-density residential structure with one level of underground parking. In this scenario, benzene is volatilizing from groundwater, as shown in this conceptual figure, and creating a vapor plume under the building. As noted previously in this presentation, the movement of vapor into a building is called vapor intrusion. When vapor intrusion is suspected, it is possible to calculate the predicted breathing zone air concentration for indoor receptors by applying an appropriate VAF. In this scenario, the benzene vapor plume has been delineated and worst case data has been identified. We have benzene vapor measurements 1 meter below the ground, or below the building. The underground parkade covers the entire footprint of the building, and no precluding conditions exist for application of VAFs or the parkade attenuation adjustment divisor, or PAD. This means we will apply VAFs and the PAD to the measured concentrations of benzene in soil vapor to calculate predicted breathing zone air concentration for parkade receptors. For the future use scenario, outdoor air exposure applies, but the focus of this example will be on parkade exposure. Given that the parkade spans the entire footprint of the structure and is closer to the vapor plume, evaluation of a residential exposure may not be needed. On the next slide, we'll look at the vapor data calculations for the future site use scenario shown here. On this slide, we can see that the measured concentration from the worst case scenario vapor well is 40,000 micrograms per meter cubed, which is shown in red because it exceeds the CSR vapor standard of 10 micrograms per meter cubed for parkade use and the upper cap concentration of 100 microgram per meter cubed for parkade use. However, this concentration is measured at 4 meters below ground surface, which is 1 meter below the building, and there are no precluding conditions for applying a VAF or pad, so we can calculate predicted breathing zone air concentration using an appropriate VAF and the pad. To do so, we need to choose an appropriate VAF from Table 1 of Protocol 22. As you can see in Table 1, there is an option for 1 meter sample depth for parkade use, shown by the arrows, which corresponds to a VAF of 2.8 times 10 to the minus 3, shown in the green box. This may be used to estimate the breathing zone air for parkade use without the application of a pad, since Protocol 22 requires that a subslab VAF of 0.02 is used when the pad is applied. The subslab VAF is shown in a red box on this slide. That said, we'll take a look at both approaches. Using the VAF for 1 meter below the ground, or below the parkade, which is 2.8 times 10 to the minus 3, we can calculate the predicted breathing zone air concentration for parkade receptors. This calculation results in an attenuated concentration of 112 micrograms per meter cubed, which is 10 times greater than the CSR standard for parkade use and above the upper cap concentration of 100 micrograms per meter cubed for parkade use. However, the parkade has a ventilation system and covers the entire footprint of the building, so a pad may be applied. The pad is a 50-time dilution factor due to air exchange from ventilation system. Using the subslab VAF and pad together, we can calculate the predicted breathing zone air concentration for parkade receptors. This calculation results in a preliminary attenuated concentration of 800 micrograms per meter cubed using just the subslab VAF, and 16 micrograms per meter cubed using the subslab VAF and the pad. 16 micrograms per meter cubed is shown in red because it still exceeds the CSR standard for parkade use. However, it is below the upper cap concentration of 100 micrograms per meter cubed. Note that the application of pad requires risk assessment, along with a performance verification plan, including the appropriate clauses. Risk estimates would be calculated with and without risk controls. Ambient air may be required to confirm the modeling, given that this is a high-risk, potentially high-risk site, and ongoing monitoring requirements may be needed. Given that predicted breathing zone air in the parkade exceeds upper cap concentrations without ventilation, the site may be classified as a high-risk site or a risk-managed high-risk site, depending on additional site-specific conditions and the nature of the ventilation system.
Okay, thanks, Jason. And well, hello, I'm back. In the next few slides, I'll explain the routing of applications, and we'll go over the conditions and requirements typically used for vapors on the certification documents. Next slide, please. So depending on the risk classification of the site, contaminated sites may be reviewed by an approved professional. Okay, so what can I please review? Non-high-risk sites are eligible to be reviewed by an approved professional as per Protocol 6. High-risk and risk-managed high-risk sites are reviewed by the Ministry, unless a Protocol 6 pre-approval to allow for an AP to review a high-risk site has been obtained. During the consideration of the application by the director, no matter which route the application took to get to the statutory decision maker, the Schedule B conditions and requirements of the certification document are an important consideration and need to accurately reflect the vapor conditions at a site. Next slide, please. So, clauses in Schedule B of the certification document. This is where we write the requirements and conditions that are necessary to maintain the validity of a certification document. I'm only focusing on the vapor clauses here. If vapor attenuation factors are applied to meet the CSR standards, they are based on assumptions about the structures, locations, and depths of present or future buildings. When you're considering remediating a site, I encourage you to think about the potential future use of the property. Just because there is currently a slab-on-grade structure at the site, it does not mean that future development would also be slab-on-grade. Consider the city's development plans and see what type of development is occurring in the area where the property is located. The majority of new developments include underground parking. Think about how many levels of parking are acceptable at a site based on your vapor conditions. Or maybe there are areas of the site that can only be built slab-on-grade while still allowing for underground parking in other areas. Remember, the more restrictive the assumptions are, the more you restrict development at your site. Next slide, please. So still on clauses B, I think Lavinia touched on a little about this in her presentation earlier today. For risk-based certificates of compliance, list any risk controls that must be maintained in order to protect human health and the environment. These risk controls can be engineering controls, such as vapor barriers, ventilation control systems, or as simple as a concrete slab or asphalt. There can also be institutional controls, such as orders, notices on record, and notifications to persons and government agencies. Next slide, please. The risk controls can also be intrinsic controls. This means an inherent feature at a site which, without the use of engineering or institutional controls, control risk to human health and environment from exposure to substances. An example of intrinsic controls for vapors is a natural physical barrier, such as the rock wall shown in the picture in the slide. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier in our Learning Series Talk 25, Performance Verification Plans, sites that require risk controls need to have a PVP. Please refer to Technical Guidance 4, entitled Vapor Investigation and Remediation, for the different expectations that need to be included in a PVP, depending on the risk management control needed at your site. Next slide, please. The final topic in our presentation is on resources for vapor assessment. As you've heard during the learning series, we are revising our site remediation website. Ministry documents such as protocol documents are posted on the site remediation website. You can find links to the legislation and director's protocols under legislation and protocols. The main protocol relating to vapor site investigation is Protocol 22. So if after reviewing the ministry's website resources, you still have questions related to vapor assessments, you can contact us with inquiries using the remediation FAQs email address, and we will respond. Next slide, please. Okay, so we will close the presentation with a few takeaways. Check that you are using the correct attenuation factor for the specific characteristics of your site. Certificates of compliance include current and future scenarios, and that Schedule B clauses may be specific to vapor situations. And sites that require risk controls need to have a performance verification plan. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.